lucky to have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker. His name is Dr. Eric Daniels, and he's a new speaker to the 21 convention. He's a guest speaker for the Ayn Rand Institute. He's also an assistant professor at Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, and he's been teaching all over internationally on American history and philosophy for the past 12 years, which is astounding because he looks very young. And I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Eric.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Well, welcome. My topic for today that I want you to think about is the idea of the self-made man. Right, it's an idea which many of us are familiar with. And what I want to start out by doing is just to ask you briefly to come up with some examples, to think of a few ideas of who are some of the best examples of self-made men. Think of people like Sam Walton, Steve Jobs, Oprah, Martha Stewart, Pierre Omidyar, who started eBay out of his own house. People like Mark Cuban, Michael Jordan. We can think of these examples all across different realms of business, different industries, a sports figure, an entertainment figure. There are a lot of people that we call self-made men. And these are usually the most successful and what ought to be the most admired people in our culture. And indeed, if you go back into American history and you look at some of the people in American history, you look at the Andrew Carnegies, the John Rockefellers, you look at some of the names that you probably don't even know, the Charles Ketterings, right, who was founder of AC Delco, or Thomson, one of the minds behind General Electric, Thomas Edison, Eli Whitney. America, in a sense, compared to other countries, compared to other cultures, is literally, in a sense, littered with stories of rags to riches, self-made men, people who picked themselves up and grew to prominence, fame, success. Now, there's a problem, though. These people are not venerated. They're not held up as the kinds of heroes that they actually are because of certain problems in our culture. One of the things that you notice when you look at the Bill Gates or the Steve Jobs, what do people actually think about these individuals? Not, wow, think about how terrific it is that this individual basically went from almost nothing or from very modest circumstances, came up with a brilliant idea, came up with a brilliant new invention or new way of doing things or new way of organizing, and made a success out of it. Actually succeeded in this world despite obstacles, despite things in their way, and achieved something great. What do people actually look at? They try to drag them down. They try to say, oh, Bill Gates is only great when he gives away billions of dollars, not when he makes billions of dollars, right? Steve Jobs, oh, he was a jerk, right? Yeah, despite the fact that everybody has an iPhone or an iPad, despite the fact that the whole telecommunications industry has been fundamentally transformed by the people that Jobs hired and the people that he worked with and the ideas that he came up with. But everybody wants to focus on the negative. Everybody wants to focus, I mean, look, when Jobs died, one of the most important things that the media reported that they obsessed about was the fact that he hadn't given away as much money as Bill Gates. Rather than focus on his achievements, rather than focus on all of the great things that he did, the ways that he transformed everyone's lives through his achievements, they wanted to focus on some of the negatives. Now, the idea of self-making, the idea of the self-made man, is a relatively new concept in the history of thought. The idea of social mobility as such is relatively new. It's really only been around for about the last 200 years. And there are a couple of really important reasons why social mobility or self-making, the idea that someone can rise from lower circumstances and move up the social ladder, move up the economic ladder, or contrary, to move down it by accident or by fault of their own. There's two reasons, really, that this idea is so new. Number one, the idea is so new because it's only in a free society that such possibilities exist, that people actually have the room and the freedom, protected politically, to be able to move up and down the social ladder. To have the idea that just because someone was born to modest circumstances, or just because someone has fallen on hard luck, doesn't mean that they can't rise up, that they can't succeed in life. Now, the other reason, of course, is just the fact of history. For thousands of years, people didn't have these opportunities because there weren't a lot of opportunities to be had. Modern civilization, in some ways, is what gives rise to the idea of a stratified social hierarchy, a stratified economic hierarchy. Before this, people basically did what their parents did. If your father was a farmer, you were a farmer, his parents were probably farmers, his parents' parents were farmers, all the way back for generations. And the techniques that you were using, the things that you were doing, were probably not substantially different in terms of your work life, your daily life, than they had been for generations. But suddenly, during the 17th and 18th century, at the time of the Enlightenment, a whole change in Western culture started to take place. People started to believe in political freedom. They started to set up the institutions, as imperfect as they may be today, for our cultural, political, and economic freedom that give us the possibility of rising up and down the social ladder. Also, the idea of the self started to change. What does it mean to define oneself? If someone came up to you on the street and said, "Tell me about yourself. Who are you?" Well, you might say your name and what you do for a living, what your interests are. Right? I mean, imagine filling out an online dating profile or something. You say, go to a matchmaker. They say, well, what are you? Who are you? The things that you reveal about yourself is what you see in yourself. But it's more complicated than that. There's something deeper than this. So what I want to do with this idea of the self-made man or self-making as an idea, today I want to take a look at some of the history of this. Where does this come from? What are the best examples of this? And then see some of the ways in which it's been corrupted. Because as I said, today, the people who are the best exemplars of self-making are often seen as objects of derision by the popular media, by popular culture, etc. And that's a very damaging thing. Because in a sense, for us, for people who actually seek self-improvement, for people who want to be better themselves, on all levels of our lives, it's very important that we understand the proper justification for this. Why should we embrace this idea? And how, in some senses, does one defend oneself against such attacks? Right? And they're myriad today. Right? You just take a look at some of the ways that people talk about the idea of self-making. As I said in the outset, they're culturally devalued. People disapprove in many ways. They want to find flaws. They want to say, oh, successful people may have lots of money or lots of fame or lots of whatever it is that they seek, but they're unhappy. Their souls are dead inside, right? And then that's why you get these biographies or these tabloids detailing all of the lives of the famous people, trying to bring them down a notch. But also, it's under explicit attack, right? There's a new book out. There's certain people in the politics today, right? You've heard this phrase, "You didn't build that," right? Well, believe me, this isn't just about what some people think about your business, if you own a business, if you've created a business, or your success. They think this in a fundamental way about yourself, right? They're almost to the point of literal determinism. They think that what you are, who you are, is shaped entirely from the outside. And whether they attribute credit to that, right, as our president does, that you didn't build that, society helped you build that, other people were there, et cetera, that kind of collectivist mentality, when it turns into the self, the individual, the person, it becomes even more damaging. This is the idea which another aspiring president, this is the "it takes a village" concept, right? That you aren't really who you are. You aren't the sum of your choices. You aren't who you are because of yourself. You're who you are because of your genetics, because of your family, because of your culture, because of your race, all of these other characteristics that you had no control over. Right? So people try to attack this idea. They say it's a myth. They try to look at statistics and say, how many people actually rise up from the bottom levels of poverty into the upper echelons of wealth? I say that's not the issue. Right? There are some people, it's not statistically likely, right? But there is a lot of mobility in American society from one level of income to another. But that's not the issue. The issue is, what does it mean for the individual? And what are the conditions under which the individual can actually exercise this self-making? What is it about? What does it actually mean? So to give you some of the examples, I wanted to start today with what I think is probably the best example in American history of self-making, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is a great example of the literature of self-making. His autobiography, or what he used to call in his life his memoirs, were a document that was very carefully constructed. In the version of an autobiography, of course, one of the great things that you have as an author is the ability to edit out the things that you don't like about your life and to promote the things that you do like about your life. And Franklin was very conscious of this. And his original conception of his memoirs was actually in a letter to his son, to try to explain to his son where it was their family had come from, where Franklin had come from. So for those of you who may not know as much about Benjamin Franklin, the story is pretty inspiring. He was born in 1706 in Boston. He was the 10th of 10 children. Imagine his poor mother, right? He was the 10th of 10 children. And his father originally had wanted him to go into the ministry. But the schooling to do so was too expensive. He had been in a Latin school and he had been in a basic grammar school, but he was pulled out by the time he was about 9 or 10 because it was too expensive for the family. After all, with 10 children, this is quite an undertaking. And his father decided that the best path for young Benjamin in his life was to be apprenticed to his older brother, basically to be sold into an indenture contract, to basically become in quasi-property of his brother, who was running a print shop at the time. And then Benjamin Franklin would learn a trade. He would learn how to be a printer, and also subsequently, because most of the print houses had a lot of the literature, the pamphlets that were being imported from Britain and things that were being written, he would learn how to be a writer as well. And Franklin took to this task, despite the friction that he had with his older brother, who basically considered him something less than one of his hired laborers, because after all, young Benjamin couldn't get out of his labor contract. It was something his father had promised to his brother, that he would serve you for X number of years and then you would release him into the world. Well, young Franklin and his older brother, who was quite a political radical at the time, started to come into conflict. The idea of how he was going to run his life was different from his older brothers, and eventually at the young age of 16, I believe, 15, 16, he decided in secret that he would run away, and he went to Philadelphia. And he started his own business. He quickly rose through the ranks. He started publishing Poor Richard's Almanac, from which we get so many of the common phrases. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, etc. Penny saved is a penny earned. All of these common stock phrases about self-improvement or about diligence and hard work probably come from Franklin, probably come from Poor Richard. He also published a number of newspaper articles. He had traveled to London. He had started to become more prominent. He had met with the governor of Pennsylvania. He was rising in the world. And then at the ripe old age of 42, because of his success as a publisher, he retired. And this is something to aspire to be so successful that you can sell your business to a partner and get residuals, basically to get payments for your investment, such that you can now support what becomes Franklin's next pursuit, scientific career. And many people remember Franklin either as the author of the Poor Richard's Almanac and the autobiography, or they remember Franklin as the politician and the diplomat. But sandwiched in between those parts of his career, he was a groundbreaking scientist. He did the fundamental work and experimentation on electricity, right? The kite, people remember the sentry box, the study of electricity. He fundamentally characterized the basic field idea. Positive and negative charge was something that Franklin came up with. Clerk Maxwell, many, many years later in the late 19th century, said that Franklin had done, if you know Maxwell's equations, this is basic electromagnetism. I don't actually know this, but I pretend to because I know the names, so I don't actually understand the theories. But Maxwell is very, very important to the field of electromagnetism. And he said Franklin had basically laid out more than any other thinker in the field. He was like the Newton of the field of electromagnetism. So Franklin had this enormously significant scientific career. He had come up with a thing that literally would save people's lives, the lightning rod. Right? Where at the time, other scientists believed that trying to attract charge out of the atmosphere and ground it was going to attract too much lightning to buildings and that it would set them afire. Franklin, of course, knew the scientific background of this, and he said, no, this will actually dissipate charge. It will save lives. Actually ended up ultimately having arguments with other English scientists. He was made a member of the Royal Society, which was absolutely unprecedented for a colonial to become a member of the prestigious Royal Society in London. After this, into the 1750s, because of his international acclaim, right, even the Queen of France had china made with Franklin's face on it because he was so well known in Europe, to which Louis was quite disappointed and had himself a chamber pot made with Franklin's face on the bottom. He did not so much like his wife being enamored of Benjamin Franklin. But because of his prominence and because of his savvy, he was appointed as a colonial agent, which meant that he was to represent Pennsylvania, and ultimately he also represented Georgia and other colonies in Parliament. And so he got involved in politics, and he became involved at the very heart of the American Revolution. Like the other patriots, he had this idea that America should have a kind of self-determination as a nation, that England was becoming oppressive, that the level of taxation, the level of interference was becoming oppressive, and that they had fundamentally different ideas about how to protect individual rights. The English believed that these were relational, that government created rights and that you should just accept them and be happy with them. Franklin and the other founders believed, no, individual rights are what individuals have as a claim against government. It's how we tell the government no. And so he became involved not only as a colonial agent, later at the Constitutional Convention, and then ultimately as a diplomat, as an attaché basically to France after the Revolution. He came back to the colonies in 1785 and shortly thereafter retired for the real retirement, which was only lasted a couple of years before his death in 1790. And in the interim, he crafted this biography, this autobiography. And the really interesting thing to me about this autobiography is Franklin is aware, as an Enlightenment thinker, as someone who had read Locke and Newton and studied the great Enlightenment thinkers, he was aware of the fact that the way that he portrayed his own personal development could become a model for others. In a sense, what he had done is he had picked up on the idea of the self-made man, which was just bubbling up into the cultural froth at the time. And he created the most effective, the most powerful, right? I mean, we still read it today. I assign it to students. I know dozens of other people assign it to their students. Great story, Thomas Mellon. Right? You guys know the Mellon Bank, ultimately the bank that's now, forget where they've merged, but the Mellon family. Mellon actually was, Thomas Mellon in the 19th century was a poor boy who read Franklin's autobiography, decided to get up off the farm, go to Pittsburgh, and start his career, which he eventually built into a successful banking career, and ultimately the Mellon Bank built itself into an international bank to compete even with the J.P. Morgans of the world at the time. He was so wealthy that by the time FDR came into office, FDR thought he was creating, that Mellon was engaged in all kinds of tax evasion and whatnot. He became public enemy number one. He was the, or not Thomas Mellon, but his heirs became public enemy number one. They were those dirty bankers that they had to go after, right? They were one of the most successful families, all because he read this model. He read this idea of what it means to make yourself. Now, there's lots of interesting passages, I recommend this is a great book to read, as well his shorter essays. There's one called The Way to Wealth, which collects a lot of the Poor Richard's phrases. But there's one part of this that I wanted to highlight, that I want to focus on today. And this is the part, he's now talking about his career as a printer and when he was in Philadelphia, starting his way to prominence. And he notes in this letter to his son, it was about this time, in the late 1720s, so he's in his mid-20s at this point. It was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. And then he details over the next few pages the ways in which he attempted to do this. And the really striking thing about this is this idea, moral perfection. Who talks about this anymore? Right? Aren't we all just flawed creatures who have all of these boils and nastiness about us, and that what we need to do is we need to avoid looking at ourselves in the mirror because after all we're all just broken individuals? He says, no, I'm going to be morally perfect. I'm not just going to try to attain moral perfection. I'm not even going to try and attain it in the next life, right, which he rejects. He's a deist. He says, look, it's all about life on this earth, and I am going to try to attain moral perfection. How is he going to do this? He's going to do it through conscious, rational planning. Right? He's going to set out a project of improving himself. And so he literally lists out 13 virtues that he's going to attempt to cultivate in himself. He lists out a program whereby how he's going to get up, what he's going to study, how he's going to go about his day, what he's going to do to make himself better into the man that he wants to be. And this process, this idea of moral perfection as a this-worldly, conscious, rational effort is what really distinguishes this literature. Now, Franklin's autobiography, after his death, was collected, these various letters. An editor hit upon these and realized, wow, this is really great stuff. So they put it together. There's 4 different parts of this letter to his son and to others that they put together. And they published this as the autobiography in the early 19th century. And early 19th century America was an incredibly ripe period for this idea. It's a politically free nation, unprecedented in human history. The amount of freedom that individuals had to engage in the kinds of things that would lead to economic success, to social mobility, etc., were unprecedented. And in addition to this, initially, American culture had a very this-worldly, pro-human happiness orientation. And so in the 1820s and 1830s, a literature starts to develop. These books are becoming models. people start to imitate Franklin. They start to write more and more self-help or self-promotion, self-cultivation type books. And in the 1830s, Henry Clay, actually the politician, in a speech in Congress by no conscious attention, actually invented the word the self-made man. Right? He was being criticized by other senators about some economic policy, and he said, no, in America we don't have hereditary aristocrats. We don't have people who are born into a station from which they can never change, right? Either on the low end or on the high end. What we have, he said, is a large number of self-made men. People who have picked themselves up basically through their own power, risen up the social hierarchy. Now, in the 19th century, this notion also, however, gets corrupted. And that's in part what I want to focus on, because this is the great tragedy. A culture in the United States in the 19th century that not only produced inventors, businessmen, popular entertainers, people that could create their own careers, right? That could create themselves, that could cultivate themselves in the image that they sought, was corrupted. And that's why today, when we have actual examples, because we still retain at least enough political freedom and economic freedom, although ever decreasing by the day, that people can still do this. And we still retain enough cultural and social freedom that we can still define ourselves. We're not a product only of our religious, racial, ethnic, economic, cultural background. We can break out of that. We can define ourselves. But there's this enormous criticism. And part of that criticism ultimately arises out of what I think are two false views that developed in the 19th century of what self-making is about. Now, on the one hand, one of these false views comes out of the idea of the Christian tradition. Right? America, as many people know, as many people will argue, is to one degree or another deeply, deeply influenced by the Christian tradition. And it became so deeply influenced during the 19th century. There's a great book by a historian called The Christianizing of American Culture, and it happened primarily in the 19th century. During the 18th century, the Enlightenment, the pro-reason, pro-life on this earth philosophy that adhered at the time, that many of Americans, if not the majority of Americans, believed in, was a very deistic, right? God sort of made the world and then went off on his own business. He's not intervening with our lives. He doesn't want us to follow any creed. He wants us to discover the laws of nature and go about our business. Changed from that into the 19th century to a very evangelical, Christian-centered culture through conscious intention of the churches at the time. And their idea of self-making was very, very different. Their idea of self-making was premised on the sense that you could make yourself in this world. It was not wholly a spiritual sort of narrative, but that you could make yourself in this world only for one purpose and only because of one particular problem with the self. Now, let me take these in reverse order. The problem with the self, the Christian church has said, is that human beings in God's creation are low, base, selfish, materialistic creatures. If you want to make yourself, if you want to make something of yourself, they said, you have to overcome that. You have to overcome your inherent flaws. You have to rise above the way that God created you. You have to somehow make it, to prove to him, in a sense, that you're better than that. You have to deny yourself. You have to deny these things. The curious part, though, was that unlike the earlier Christian narratives about the saints and how they led lives of true faith and ultimately were rewarded in the afterlife, is that in the 19th century, this culture of the Enlightenment had so imbued America with the idea of success in this world that the Christian thinkers actually said, being rich is okay, right? Russell Conwell, who was the founder of Temple University, a Baptist preacher, gave a speech. He was a public speaker at the time, and he gave the same speech, believe this, there's no television or internet, so he had to give the same speech over and over, something like 9,000 times in the space of 20 years. And it was called Acres of Diamonds. And this, I think, is the paradigm example of the Christian idea of self-making. Acres of Diamonds was a speech where a Baptist preacher said, God says there is a duty to be rich. Why? Well, because only the rich man can do good works. If you're poor, how can you do charity? How can you do this altruistic service to your fellow man if you're not rich? So this is the purpose, right? Number one, you have to overcome your own base desires and your own materialistic interests. And number two, the Christian self-maker said, you have to do this for a limited purpose. The purpose is basically to deny yourself, right? To build up riches not for your own enjoyment or for the enjoyment of those that you value, your spouse, your children, etc., but for others. It's only morally good, they said, to make something of yourself, to go from rags to riches, if you do so in the service of others. Now, the consequences of this are incredibly damaging. This is why, for example, people criticize Steve Jobs for not giving away enough of his money, or for not doing so in as public a way, say, as Bill Gates has done in his family. Right? This is why people say you're only good if once you rise to the top, you help out those that got you there. Right? Those who really built that. Right? Whether you've been the one struggling, sweating, working hard, building the business, overcoming the obstacles, filling out the government bureaucrats' forms, all these other things. You're the one that did all of that, but when you get to the top, they say, you've got to pay your pound of flesh. Not only to the government now, but also to everyone beneath you. The Christian view of self-making in the 19th century context, this idea that you have a duty to be rich so that you can do Christian service, is incredibly damaging because it takes the self out of self-making. The self-made man is no longer a self-made man. You're almost a vehicle, a vessel through which society can build up wealth and then transmit it to those who need it or who can claim it. Now, this is very, very damaging. Imagine motivating someone. Imagine yourself saying, well, I could start a business. I've got this great idea, an entrepreneurial idea. You know, someone on the internet hasn't figured out how to sell blank. If I knew an actual example, well, I wouldn't share it with you, first of all, because I'd be the one that wanted to do it. But if I knew an actual example, somebody probably would have already tried it. But there's a lot of things, arbitraging debt or selling different things or figuring out ways of, using this technology to make money. You look at that and you say, I've got this great idea to make money. But then you realize if the context is, if the culture is, that's only good for you if you do so in the service of others. Well, when you're up against the wall, right? When you're staying up 18 hours a day doing the coding or the programming or making the business deals, what's going to motivate you? Clearly, it's not yourself. And so it detaches the self from that process. And that's incredibly damaging because I think ultimately what that means is that it doesn't work. You can't motivate someone in that extrinsic way, in that external way, because if you're telling them to improve themselves for someone else, they're not getting anything out of it. Right? There's a disconnect between the idea of self-making. Why not be one of the recipients? Right? Why not let other people be the vessel of spreading the nation's wealth? Well, of course, we know the problem is if everyone turns around and says this, there is no wealth created, and we might as well go back to when we all do what our parents did. There's no social mobility in the sense that you have to do it for others. Now, the other major flaw, the other characteristic error that the 19th century produced in the idea of self-making, on the one hand was the Christian idea, what would be called something like the duty-based version of self-making. You have a duty to improve yourself, right? Even if you don't like it, even if it's not good, even if it isn't one of your values, you go do it, right? Andrew Carnegie even had this, right? In his he wrote a piece called The Gospel of Wealth. Andrew Carnegie said basically, wealth has no value except in as much as you can give it to other people, right? Except that you can endow libraries and schools and do things. Now, he had a slightly more pro-self idea. He said, you've got to have to help those who can help themselves. He was opposed to just blanket charity, giving people money. He said, you give them the tools with which they can make themselves. But he still morally justified it as giving to others. Now, the other error is what I would call the kind of subjectivist, the me generation, if you want to call it that, the idea of self-making, that's all just about the subjective whim, right? You don't like the world as it is, you don't like conditions as they are, so you just figure out a way to feel better about it, right? This is the opposite pole. This is self-making as a psychological indulgence, right? And this literature also becomes popular. In the early part of the 20th century, probably the three most popular self-help books, Norman Vincent Peale's Think and Grow, or no, he wrote, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget, and The Power of Positive Thinking, right? Norman Vincent Peale, and then Napoleon Hill wrote Think and Grow Rich, and then everybody's favorite, probably the most famous, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? And what do these individuals, this is the post-Freudian world, this is the post-Deweyan world, so Sigmund Freud, the whole psychoanalysis, that it's all a matter of how you think about yourself and repress all of your Oedipal complexes, etc. And it's also Deweyan in the sense that it's not really about the self, it's about how you reflect the self in society. And this is all really focused on the self. It doesn't make the same error that the Christian self-makers do of divorcing the self from the process of self-making, but it detaches self-making from any visible external goal. Right? The idea of this self-making is entirely focused around some psychological characteristic. Now, of course, these self-help manuals still promise riches on the other end. Think and grow rich. Right? Win friends and influence people. Positive thinking. And they had an enormous number of testimonials about, oh, I read The Power of Positive Thinking and I beat Muhammad Ali. And there was famously, there was a boxer who claimed that reading this book was what allowed him to defeat Muhammad Ali. Now, I think probably his left hook or maybe a good jab was what allowed him to defeat. But it's all the psychological sense. Now, in some contexts, this psychological self-making can be a part of proper self-making. The problem is that it completely detaches itself from any real values in the world. Why should you make yourself? What should you make yourself into? Well, I don't know, whatever you want, right? If you want to make yourself into, you do some kind of self-indulgent, pop some drugs, sit on a hill and figure out who you are, that's just as much self-making as, say, coming up with a great idea, succeeding in the world, and accomplishing something for yourself, pursuing real values, health, wealth, etc. So there's this divergence in the 19th century. By the 20th century, what this means is that the literature and the idea culturally of self-making has become very confused. Right? We see some individuals, great athletes, for example, who pick themselves up from being cut from their basketball team, et cetera. Michael Jordan kind of story. You get cut from your basketball team. What do? You go out and you practice. You work even harder. You become more determined. You change yourself. You adapt to circumstances. You figure out what is necessary to your success, to your goal. Right? And Michael Jordan's goal obviously was to be the best basketball player ever. And many would argue he probably achieved that, at least within his generation. Arguments to current players notwithstanding, Michael Jordan was the best basketball player who ever lived when he retired. And he set himself that goal, and he did everything necessary to that goal. He engaged in a process of rational planning and thinking, just like Franklin had suggested. Now, it's a different goal. But then look at what happens. A Michael Jordan or Sam Walton or a Steve Jobs gets pulled down by this. Right, on the one hand, the people who make the mistake of the psychological self say, oh, but they're unhappy. Look, he got divorced. Look, he doesn't have everything he wants. Look, he's psychologically troubled. Or they make the example, he doesn't do enough for others. He didn't really do this. It's not his responsibility. Somebody else built that, right? Michael Jordan can't play by himself, right? He needs 4 other guys on the court. Right? This fallacy that just because other people are involved in mutual trade operations, right, which is basically what a team is, you're doing trading skills and interests in the common goal of victory. I always like that. You guys know that quotation from Michael Jordan? Although there's no I in team, there is in win. Right? He told a coach that once. His coach said, there's no I in team. And he said, well, there is in win. Right? Which is, if I want to win and I want to be a part of this team, I have to focus on myself, but obviously not to the detriment of other players. We all know the characteristic player in sports who actually is not so much selfish as self-indulgent. Right? Showy, show off, and they don't win. Right? They lost the I in that sense. But whether it's Michael Jordan or Sam Walton or Steve Jobs, the culture starts to corrode this away. Even though there are still examples of people doing this, we aren't like the 19th century. If you go back to the early 19th century, it's just astounding. The literature, we could fill this whole stage with books of examples of literature. McGuffey readers, right, what they used to give to school children, the Horatio Alger stories, right, the very famous series of books which were all about little kids, basically street urchins who picked themselves up and didn't necessarily earn riches, but earned respectability. They made their way in the world. They got a better job than what their other little friends on the street, the little guys running around homeless and whatnot. They actually made it out of that, and he portrayed that. Now, the answer that I think we can give, the reason why I think this is, we can possibly recapture this, is that I think Ayn Rand has given us, the philosopher, the novelist Ayn Rand, has given us an idea of the self that actually is more compatible and, in fact, builds on that Enlightenment tradition. So many of you probably have heard of Ayn Rand. She wrote the books Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, etc. Some of you have probably read them. But it's her idea of the self, I think, that transcends a lot of these errors, that builds into the idea of self-making. And there's a great line that she has, one of her characters in one of her novels, in Atlas Shrugged, says, and this is a brilliant example of how she brings together the idea of the self in a way that hadn't been done since the Enlightenment. As man, she writes, is a being of self-made wealth, so he is a being of self-made soul. And by soul, she simply means character or what you are, your consciousness, who you are as a person. Right? As man is a being of self-made wealth, he is a being of self-made soul. In a sense, what she's saying is that human beings, by their nature, have a very, very deep set of requirements of how they have to go about living their lives. Number one, obviously, we have our physical sustenance to attain to, right? We have to go after proper nutrition, proper physical culture, right? You need to be healthy. You need to do the things that maintain your physical self. And you have to do that yourself, right? And famously, there's another line where she explains, you can share a meal, but you can't digest together, right? We can sit down and split a steak. I'd love to do that. Hey, somebody wants to break out a steak, let's go, right? But you can't eat that steak and say, oh, I'll digest it for you, right? That's an individual operation. Ultimately, getting that steak, right? How we acquire it, whether we earn the money to go to the store to buy it or whether we hunt it ourselves or whatever it happens to be, right? Or whether we steal it from lions after they've made a kill. Or if you guys have seen this National Geographic video, these bushmen in Africa, they actually steal from lions. It's amazing stuff. No matter how you do that, you have to do that. Right? This is the perspective. You ultimately are responsible for your own physical survival. Whether that means earning the money by working for someone else in order to pay for the housing, the clothing, the shelter, all of the things, the food that provide your sustenance, right? The workout sessions, whatever it happens to be. Like that, she says, you have a psychological self that is also self-made. You are, in a sense, your character, your soul, as it were, is just as important a thing to cultivate, who you are as a person. Now, this idea that she has fits right in with Franklin's idea, that passage that I read. Ayn Rand calls this moral ambitiousness. Right? She calls it the virtue of pride, is moral ambitiousness. The idea that you set up your own set of values. You're not born with those values. Right? As an infant, borrowing Locke's phrase, she says you're born tabula rasa. You're born as a blank slate. Right? You don't have any values that are automatically given to you. You have certain needs, right? Physical needs, psychological needs, etc. But how do you attain those? You have to figure that out. And you have to figure out what values you want to attain. Believe it or not, people can pursue different values. Right? People can have different goals in life. We don't all have to be engineers, or we don't all have to play basketball. We don't all have to do the same thing. What Ayn Rand says is you have to define what you want, figure out the means of getting it, and then pursue it. And pursue it not just half-heartedly, but as she says, with this moral ambitiousness, to define what type of person you want to be. And to do so with reference not just to the internal, as the subjectivists often do, right? As they say, just go find yourself, man. If you need to drop some acid to do that, or if you need to just sit around for a while or do whatever, find yourself. Right? She says, find yourself within the context of something that's actually successful for your life. Figure out what values that you can pursue that are consonant with the life of a rational being that you want to pursue. Who are you? Going back to that question, who are you? When you tell someone your career, your values, your interests, that's what she means. And crucially, she says those things are subject to, in a sense, your dominion. You get to have say over those. You, in a sense, are the ultimate arbiter of yourself. Who you are, who you become, and ultimately, crucially, the self-esteem that you derive from that, the picture of yourself. If you were to sit down, as Benjamin Franklin did, and author an autobiography, tell the story of who you are as a person, it would be much better than a biography because you get to pick and choose. What did those crucial moments along the path of your life mean to you? When did you choose those values? How did you overcome the background, right? Everybody gets those values, right? Your parents give them to you, your churches give them to you, your school gives them to you. But there's a point in your life Whether it's in your teenage years or your 20s, or some people it doesn't happen until they're much later in life. There's a point in your life where you ultimately have the choice to say, is this who I am? Do I accept or reject that? Does this make sense for me? And guess who the standard is? The standard is not your parents, your church, your school, whatever. The standard is you and your view of how that works in reality. Reality is the ultimate arbiter. Can you do this and be successful? Can you make a self that's vibrant? Or as Aristotle used to say, the philosopher Aristotle, the idea of flourishing. Right? You don't just want to succeed in life, you want to flourish. Right? Bare physical survival, bare career survival. Right? There's a lot of people that are just going on autopilot. Right? They're healthy enough, they're happy enough, they have a decent enough relationship, they have a decent enough set of career goals, but are they really flourishing? No. Why not? Because those goals, those relationships, that health, all of those things basically have been determined from the outside for them. They have no autonomy. True happiness, true fulfillment, true flourishing, Ayn Rand says, comes from making conscious decisions about all of those issues in our lives. So figuring out, right? We don't all have to figure out the mechanics behind why our automobile works, but you have to figure out what kind of car represents what you want to drive. Are you a sports car guy? Are you an SUV guy? What does that say about me? Right? You don't all have to pursue the same career. You don't all have to pursue the same career path. Some of you may want to go work for a big company. Some of you may want to be independent businessmen, etc. But what you have to do is figure out what is appropriate for you. Am I the type of person? Is this me? Is myself the type of person that wants to pursue this type of career? Because that process, she says, is what leads to true fulfillment. Now, the interesting thing about this, and to go back for a moment to the mythology of today, or the criticism about the mythology of today, what this means is not, as people often criticize, that everyone has to become a billionaire, successful businessman in the steel, power or whatever industry that her characters are in. She writes characters that are, one of her characters, probably the most self-made of all her characters, is Hank Rearden, who invents a new metal. Right, in the book Atlas Shrugged, he's a metallurgist and he's a businessman and he goes into the steel industry and he works for 16 years to invent a new alloy, which is pretty damn cool, right? I mean, it's lighter, cheaper, and more durable than steel. It's going to revolutionize industry in the same way that steel took us out of the Iron Age into the Steel Age. He's going to do the same thing, right? And this process that she depicts, of course, is of this Titan industrialist. And so people say often when criticizing the idea of self-making, oh, well, everyone can't be a titan of industry. Everyone can't be a brilliant metallurgist. Everyone can't be the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. But that's not the point. And the point is that no matter what your chosen occupation, no matter what level you rise to, the more important question is whether it's done on your terms, with your values. And so there are characters, right? So there's another character in the novel who basically is an office assistant. He's not particularly intellectually brilliant. He's not going to start a new business. He's not going to start a new company. But he's going to do his job and pursue his values with the same kind of moral ambitiousness that someone who goes all the way to the top can. What Rand's point is not that in order to be successful, we all have to be billionaires. I mean, it would be nice. I'd like to have a bunch of friends that are all billionaires, right? If you guys all want to make billions of dollars, like that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. But that's not the measure of success. The measure of success, if that's what you want to go for, then that will be your measure of success. But for some of you, the measure of success may be to be successful in my career, to find a good relationship, and to have the best physical development possible, right? You're into bodybuilding, so that's your thing. Some of you may say, I want the best career I can get, but for a while I'm going to pursue another path. I'm going to be a chef. Right? I'm going to do this at home at first. I'm going to try this out. My friends are going to eat a bunch of bad meals for a while, but I'm going to get better and better and better. And I'm going to pursue that as a value, and ultimately I'm going to pursue that so that can be my full-time career. Right? Now, you may or may not make billions of dollars doing that, but it's about the process. It's about identifying what's valuable to yourself that can lead you to success out there in the world and pursue it. No matter what the scope of that is, because the scope of all of these things differs. just in the sense that I could, I might want to be a world-class athlete. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen. I mean, despite what the Huffington Post said during the Olympics, I don't know if anybody saw this. This was a great piece. The Huffington Post had all this Olympics coverage, and one of the pieces that they had was, train like an Olympic athlete. How to. And I thought, if I could train like an Olympic athlete, why am I not an Olympic athlete? I can't train like an Olympic athlete. My body can't tolerate it. I wouldn't be able to do it, right? But within the scope of your ability, if you pursue those values, if you identify and define those values selfishly for yourself, and that you make that conscious, rational process to plan out how you're going to pursue them, that is what true self-making is about. Such that any of us can say, I am my own man. Why? Not because I don't owe debt to anyone, not because I don't have a business that depends upon other people and trading with other people, not because I literally think of myself in a solipsistic way as being divorced from all other people, right? Which is the caricature that the "you didn't build that" preys upon. That's a caricature. That's not reality. Reality is, of course, people trade. Of course, people have relationships with other people. But when you say, I am my own man, what you mean is, I am my own moral sovereign. I choose who I am. I define who I am. And when I don't like it, I can change it and fix it. That's what self-making is really about. And that's ultimately, I think, what we can get back to, this tradition of Benjamin Franklin. If you read Ayn Rand's works, most of her characters have some element of self-making in them, defining themselves. This is what it's really all about. And this ultimately is what can lead everyone, not necessarily, I'm not going to promise you all wealth. I'm not going to promise you all, superior physical development. I'm not going to promise you anything. All I'm going to promise you is that you can say, at the end of the day, I am my own man. I am who I choose to be. Myself is who I chose. So let's wrap up there. Hopefully there's still some time left for questions. Yeah? Got some questions? Couple questions? Sure. Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for your speech. I thought that was very helpful.
Well, thank you.
So my question is, as a part of being self-made, a lot of times when you pursue a path, you have to not care about what other people think. It might be your family or it might be your friends. But, when do you draw the threshold? Because a lot of times, you could be going down a path and it might not be the right path, and there are people who are wise enough to see that, but you can't see it yourself. How would you balance that indifference factor?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. It's a very, very practically difficult question. There is a balance to be drawn between just saying, look, I'm going to define my terms. I'm going to go ahead, full steam, who cares? Other people aren't going to hold me back. And on the other side, say, well, there are people who are smarter, wiser, and more experienced than I am, who are going to be along the way as I'm going full steam, shouting at me as I go by, there's a cliff ahead, right? Now, how does one balance that? I think that the best, just in general, right, because a lot of these might deal with concrete specifics, but in general, I think that the best way of approaching these issues is by approaching them by saying, other people do have value to contribute to my growth. The question is, how is that process defined? Do people make a claim on me? Right? Your parents say, oh, but you're hurting the family, or your friends say, oh, we don't want to, we don't like who you're becoming, or whatever, versus people who want to make a trade with you. Right? People who see the value that you're pursuing and want to promote your development. Right? And you can start to see in a lot of general contexts, there are people who make claims on you, who want to hold you back. Right? Those are the people, you don't necessarily just ignore them, but you take what they say and you evaluate it. Right? One of the other great things that, one of the other great passages, Ayn Rand has a passage where essentially this idea of the self-made man, part of moral ambitiousness and part of the whole idea, which I know Yaron Brook is going to be talking about next, part of the whole ideal of pursuing one's self-interest means never failing to pronounce moral judgment. Right? To say, look, you may have an opinion about what I'm doing, how I'm pursuing my self-development. I have a brain. I have a rational capacity. I can evaluate that given the facts. Now, the people who will contribute and who will actually on this other side have something to say, can help you out, etc., will see that and will want to help promote your self-development. And you'll be able to see, I think, probably in your own experience, the difference between people who want to make a claim on you and say, don't go there, you're surpassing me, you're no longer listening to me, et cetera, and people who want to promote your self-development because they see that it's in their rational self-interest. Because the better that you become, right? I mean, if someone says, look, this business idea you have, it's a big risk here and you're not taking account of this variable, and you say, oh, wow, now I can take account of that variable. Why are they telling you this? Well, because they see you're a potential trading partner in the future. If you're successful, if your business takes off, you're a better friend, a better business partner, or whatever to have. Whereas if someone's trying to pull you back, if mom's saying, oh, but don't violate the family traditions, et cetera, they're pulling you back, what does that mean? That means they're trying to stop your self-development. Now, you have to evaluate those, right? You have to morally judge which of those is actually contributing to your self-development and based upon a real standard, right? You say, look, are your concerns, you're yelling there's a cliff, is there a basis for that in reality? Or are you just trying to scare me? Right, and that, I think, is the way to differentiate those types of when should you just plow forward and ignore people. Because inevitably, as you go through this process in business, in life, in social life, et cetera, there are always going to be people pulling like that. But there's also going to be people who have advice, and experience will teach a lot. Yeah. There was another question. I don't know how to feel. The microphone's in the back, so I guess we go to the mic.
Okay. Hello, good morning. First of all, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
If the measure of success is not being a billionaire or not inventing the iPhone, not having a super hot wife, why do we keep referring to that as the measure of success? Aren't we fostering new generations of just frustrated youth that they will never be good enough?
Well, so this is an interesting question. If the standard of success is not necessarily being a billionaire, inventing a new iPhone, having a hot wife, I forget the last thing you said, but if those aren't the standard of success, is there a danger in promoting those as the measure of success? Well, I think there is something to that, right? Now, I want to clarify. Making $1 billion or becoming, whatever wealth is. I mean, in a generation it'll be $1 trillion just to be wealthy, right? With the way the money system is going. But not to depress all of you, but that can be your goal. That can be your measure of success. If you set that, if your chosen goal is, I want to have a level of success that is, that puts me at a financial position as such, that can be your goal, but it doesn't have to be. The problem, though, as you point out, there is a cultural standard, right? And that cultural standard of what is defined as success can have an effect on what people pursue. Now, if you ask me, just off the cuff, what is our cultural definition of success? Well, it's probably getting 15 minutes of internet fame and having a sex tape and being famous, and then being able to launch a career as, I don't know, what is it Kim Kardashian does? I mean, a career as famous for being famous or being related to someone famous. I mean, culturally, there is a very, very important barometer, as it were, of what people see as successful. Right now, yes, money, having a hot wife, having a certain kind of fame is what's seen as successful. Why aren't we championing, for example, the geeks of Silicon Valley, right? The guys and the men and women who actually put together the technologies that make the iPhone possible? Why aren't we, as a culture, championing the people who do reach success, but not necessarily in all of these levels, right? What a culture measures as its success, what it sees as successful, does tell us a lot about the values that culture holds. And right now, I'd say ours is pretty mixed, right? Our culture does sometimes value genuine success. We see this periodically in certain moments of cultural episodes. In the Olympics, people genuinely value the hard work and determination that it takes to attain that level of performance. Sometimes people do celebrate the individuals who attain business success, but there's also a lot of image success, false success that doesn't really have a grounding in anything. I mean, I don't want to completely disparage. Not all of it is worthless, but it tells you that if fame is being pursued for its own purposes, right, as opposed to for the achievements that you have, that might be a barometer of a bad sign in the culture. And the culture championing the success of people, people who have all sorts of problems. I mean, they're fascinated by the people that, the more defective the person is, the more famous they become. I mean, it's weird, right? I mean, defective as in like sort of socially defective, not physical deformities, but like, oh, I've had 6 wives and I have 27 children and oh, I now have my own reality TV show. right? I mean, if you say, and that suddenly that turns into success, that might be a bad thing, right, as a culture. What we need to do is we need to value true achievement, right? Life-promoting achievements, which the last I checked, having a reality show doesn't do a whole lot to promote one's true achievement. Building companies, having successful relationships. I mean, even something so simple as having a successful family, right? I mean, this is the point, that success can be defined on all levels, that it doesn't only appertain to those on the upper echelons of wealth and notoriety. Success can be choosing consciously to have a family and choosing consciously how you're going to rear your children to make them the best, happiest, most successful children you possibly can, and then engaging in that process, and then seeing those children grow up, develop, become educated, and become successful adults. That can be a measure of success. It's one that's not going to get reported in the papers. It's one that's not going to become no one's going to know about this besides you and your immediate family and your friends. But that can be a tremendous gauge of success. I mean, after all, being a successful parent I'm not one myself. I'm not a parent, so I'm successful or otherwise. But I'm sure that can be an incredibly rewarding experience. And to the extent that people choose to do that, right, rather than the kind of accidental parenthood that we seem so common today, right, that, it just sort of happens and I sort of raise the kid or whatever. But to choose to do that as a value can be incredibly rewarding, possibly more so than making those millions of dollars, if that's what you value. Right? So the cultural side, there is a kind of cultural barometer there that I think you've identified. But at the same time, we as a culture, we have to celebrate the success and promote the idea of success on a rational model. Right? We have to, you just, instead of saying, oh yeah, what did Kim Kardashian do? Say, oh hey, did you hear about this great businessman? Right? Or, oh hey, did you hear about this, my friend who's really doing a great job parenting? Or, oh hey, my friend who just got promoted or whatever. I mean, to actually promote that culturally, right, would do a lot. Would do a lot to bring back that idea of self-making as a true rational pursuit. And so that's all we have time for? Okay, so thank you very much. Gentlemen, I appreciate it. If you have more questions,